Well, Pope Francis had a complex and sometimes contradictory record on LGBTQ plus rights. In 2013, he famously said, "Who am I to judge?" when it came to gay people. On October the 21st, 2023, he signed a document that allowed transgender people to be baptized and to serve as godparents. 2 months later, Pope Francis approved blessings for same-sex couples, providing that the rite did not resemble marriage. But also that he faced criticism for not going far enough. And in 2024, he allegedly used a pejorative term in the Italian language to describe gay men. So let's talk about Pope Francis's impact on the trans and LGBTQ plus Catholic communities, and bring in Max Kuzma, who is a Catholic trans activist in Ohio, Emma Cieslik, a queer disabled public historian in Washington, D.C., and Simon Fung, who is the host of the award-winning podcast Dear Alana, which talks of the story of Alana, a young queer woman in Colorado who wants to become a nun. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Max Kuzma, first of all, was Pope Francis an ally?
Absolutely. I would say he was an ally. I had the opportunity to meet him in October of last year, and I told him in Spanish, so in his native language, I said, "I'm a transgender man and a friend of Father James Martin, who is an American Jesuit priest who has been hugely instrumental in creating a space of welcome for LGBTQ Catholics." So yes, resoundingly, he's an ally. He smiled when I said it, and I felt welcomed by him.
Emma Cieslik, I hope I'm pronouncing your surname correctly.
It's okay.
What was your thoughts of his impact for your community?
Most definitely. I think for me, speaking personally for myself, just imagining that there was a future for LGBTQ plus Catholics was incredibly important. Even though the actions that he took were sometimes small, they had a huge resounding impact and were heard by the community. I currently work and founded the Queer and Catholic Oral History Project, and as a cradle Catholic myself, imagining that there was a future within the church could only exist because of the steps that he took during his papacy.
Simon Fung, did he go far enough to welcome LGBT Catholics? You get the sense that sometimes he seemed to reach one hand towards them, and then the Vatican kind of pulled him back and tried to kind of clarify the situation afterwards.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky situation he found himself to be in as the Pope because, on the one hand, the Catholic Church has a long tradition of, teachings that are based on a tradition that at some level excludes LGBTQ folks. On the other hand, we have new information, right, that's coming from the experiences of, people like myself and Max and Emma who are, living the actual teachings in their lives. And so I'd say, the Pope in a way has made space for the conversation to begin to happen in a way that I don't see any, I don't see any precedent for before. And so I think that, for that to continue for folks who are, Catholic and queer to be able to share their experiences needs to continue to happen because that's the only way that we'll have the data to be able to understand these topics more clearly.
Emma, did he go far enough in your view?
I would say Simon does a good job answering this question, but I think it's complicated. I would say from my perspective, he did a number of good things in opening the door to imagine that I and many others could even exist within this church. I think if without Pope Francis's papacy, the Queer and Catholic Oral History Project, and even my continued faith or hope for faith in the church would not exist. But I think there's always room for growth. And something that he did, I think, were tempered by knowing and understanding how to exist and push for change in a church that maybe is not the best at pushing for advances and seeing a future that looks different from what it looks like now.
Yeah,
and Max, yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that it's definitely baby steps, but like even towards the end of his life, he was making new connections. So I know that he had a very famous friendship with Juan Carlos, a gay man, and that they met pretty regularly. And that, I think, had a huge impact on him, the personal relationship. And towards the end of his life, I know that, I had a meeting with him. I know other transgender Catholic people who did as well. And he had a 90-minute private meeting with an LGBTQ Catholic organization featuring transgender people and even a physician. So I think had he had more time, maybe he would have been able to even develop that relationship with transgender people even more. And I think that's also another way that we see change, is when people in positions of authority in religious institutions like the Catholic Church are willing to be in dialogue, in conversation, and even just seen with people from marginalized groups like the trans community.
I was going to ask you, Max, I mean, there is so much, I was going to say vitriol, really, towards the trans community at the moment, particularly in the US. There have been very strong anti-trans policies by the Trump administration. So I just wonder, as a trans activist yourself, how are you feeling at the moment, and do you feel that you are going to be missing a voice like Pope Francis at the moment with everything that's happening in your country?
Yeah, 100%. That's an understatement. Having a voice of a pastoral leader who is calm and welcoming, and has an example of actually meeting with and being with people. Again, as kind of Emma and Simon have touched on, it's not the same thing as making church teaching say that trans people are all good, all great, but it's worlds apart from the example that we see in American politics and the American climate in general. Even in response to some of the Trump administration's latest policies about trans people, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops were particularly silent, or just didn't really respond to the parts that implicated transgender people, and only seemed to really respond to the parts that were about immigration. So even on a local American level, we were lacking that type of example that Pope Francis, as the head of the church, had exemplified. So it is a time of anxiety to see who could even possibly try to fill that space.
And Simon, I know that you had conversion therapy even at one point. So how difficult is it to be LGBTQ plus and Catholic, and how important has it been to hear some of the kind of outreach that Pope Francis has made during his papacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all three of us, Max, Emma, and myself, what makes us unique in this situation in talking to you today is that I think we all grew up in the kind of culture war Catholic bubble of America, and with that came a lot of practices, including conversion therapy, that we earnestly, myself, I can speak for myself, earnestly pursued in our attempt to be faithful. And I think that what Pope Francis has been doing is, at least for me personally, is opened up a new horizon around what the church is, and that there's more beyond politics in the church, and that there's actually a bigger picture here. And that has certainly allowed me to, reconstruct my faith in light of a lot of those harmful practices, which unfortunately have been sort of part and parcel with a particular ascendant version of, conservative Catholicism in the United States. But, I think the Pope Francis has basically been pointing to a post-culture war church, and I'm excited about what that future could look like.
And what should that future, Emma, look like for your community going forward? I mean, how worried are you about the rising transphobia and homophobia towards the LGBTQ plus community, and how important is it to the next pope continues that kind of outreach towards you?
Most definitely. I think it's an important question to think about more than ever. I will say that I am especially concerned with the rise of violent queerphobia and transphobia here in the United States that's threatening people's lives, especially lives at the intersection of various different identities. One thing that I know Max, Simon, and I have discussed previously is the idea that trans and queer children will continue to be born into Catholic families. So whether or not the church is ready to approach and understand what it looks like for radical inclusion and what it looks like for these queer and trans children to be active members of the church, that will be the purview of the next pope, and what I hope will be the next pope's mission for making the church more inclusive and opening the doors, even if just slightly more, so that people like us in the next generation will see ourselves reflected in leadership. I will also say that I envision for the future of the church, I believe, as Pope Francis began to do, thinking critically about the ways in which systems of power, including systems of patriarchal power and bureaucratic power, exist within the church and are often used against communities that have already been marginalized. I know the Pope has spoken out about immigrant communities, but especially women in the church space, navigating and understanding and exploring how they have historically been key members of the church community, but also key members of the LGBTQ plus community moving forward. So my goal is that the seeds that Pope Francis has laid of thinking critically and not only challenging, but hoping to enrich the church by looking critically at the power structures it gathers, will lead the next Pope to continue the legacy of work about liberation and hope for a different future in the next papacy.
Emma Cieslik, Max Kuzma and Simon Fung, thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Well, it is getting towards evening here on St. Peter's Square as the Rosary and the first service continues to remember Pope Francis on the day that he died. 88 years old, a man who led this church for 12 years, who was revered by his supporters, and who really built the image of the church, softening the image of the church when he inherited it at a pretty low ebb in its history, and built its reputation and built his own reputation indeed as a world leader. 88 years old, he died this morning at 7:35 a.m. local time, according to the Vatican. We will continue to bring you lots of reaction from here and right across the world to the death of Pope Francis. But for now, from here in St. Peter's Square, I will hand you back to my colleague Luke Jones in London.
Mark, thank you very much for that.